Okay, good morning or good afternoon, or hello to our visitors and viewers. I'm Mike Byram, Emeritus Professor at the University of Durham in the northeast of England, and I'm accompanied by John Daniels, who is a former French teacher and head of a middle school in the north of east of England. And today we're in conversation with Alan Dobson. Alan, perhaps you'd like to briefly introduce yourself before we start the conversation as such.
Yep, okay. I'm a bit unusual in this series in that my first foreign language is Spanish. I always feel that I fly the flag for all languages, but that's my prime area of expertise. I was, for some 20 years, Her Majesty's Inspector for Modern Languages, and worked for the last 20 years as a consultant in doing evaluations for national and international education programs in the languages field. There's no point in me going on more because that's what you're probably going to ask me about, and so I can fill that in later. So back to you, Mike.
Okay, yes, thank you. And so just to clarify for our viewers, of course, Alan has been involved in this as one of the interviewers for our previous conversations with other people. So he knows what's coming, as it were, but we will be talking to him about his language life and his view of language teaching. And we will begin autobiographically. John will take over in a second, and then gradually we'll move to the more language teaching perspectives. But John, please take over and get us started.
Yes, good morning, Alan. As Mike says, it's the biographical side of things, how you got involved in languages. Early school, was there something there, a particular teacher who enthused you, or did it happen later? Just looking back all that way.
It goes back before I started languages at school. In my case, my initial motivation for doing languages wasn't actually language. It was curiosity about people in other countries and history of other countries. And for me, although I came to like studying language for its intrinsic interest, what set me on the path really was needing a language or languages to pursue that interest. And it might seem strange, but the people who had the biggest influence on me weren't actually linguists. So perhaps I better explain that one. The first motivation was actually from my granddad. He's a very interesting guy. He was a Victorian, obviously. And despite living in an imperial age, he always took the view that it was repulsive to make the assumption, which a lot of popular literature did at that time, that an Englishman was sometimes worth more than a person of any other language. And he strongly resisted that, which probably didn't make him too popular in the days when we got an empire. The other thing about him was that he was a minor, but he was an autodidact. Now, when he was a young man, he was functionally illiterate, I gather. But when I knew him, when I was at primary school, he'd actually moved to a situation where he could read serious historians like A.J.P. Taylor without any trouble at all. My dad also was an interesting influence, because he believed that you should be open to other ideas and tolerant of other people. And one of the things he used to say to me was, before you get into an argument, just remember, as a starting point, there's a 50% chance the other guy could be right. And I wouldn't say I've followed that advice all my life, but I thought it was a damn good piece of advice, which I've relayed to my son. I will not comment to what extent he heeds my advice, but there you are. So that was the first one. The second, so it's partly family. The second one was my history teacher at school, who was probably the best teacher of any subject I've ever had. He was also brilliant at pastoral work as well. He was a war veteran, but his internationalism sat alongside his patriotism. And his view from the war was the people on the other side were just people like him. His opponents in the desert were people who probably didn't want to be there any more than he did. So you had a job to do, but you didn't look down on other nationalities and regard them as inferior. And he came back from the war, as many others did, with a vision of how the UK and Europe might move forward into a more enlightened era. And so that interest in things international was reinforced by that. But the other one was, the first linguist who influenced me was, by complete chance, the primary school I went to in a mining village in South Yorkshire had a teacher who was an Oxford languages graduate, strangely enough, who was filling in time between national service and going on to teach French in a grammar school. We didn't have French in the curriculum, but he used to talk about his experiences using other languages. And that caught on with me, and I thought, I want to be like him. I want to be able to do that. And the final thing that he said was, he told my parents, and I don't know what he was going on because we weren't doing languages, but he told my parents that he had a hunch I could be good at languages. So that's how it started. And other influences I might come to weren't linguists either. So if you want to move on to the next chapter, do you want to ask me about what happened when I went to secondary school, or where are we going next?
Yes, I think, I mean, that's really interesting. There is a teacher who really made a difference, the history teacher. And I think in a lot of cases, there is somebody like that. But secondary school obviously was a big step. And then you started learning languages. So what particular memories do you have of that time?
Traumatic initially. I was all keen to go to secondary school to do science and to do languages, because we did very little science as well at primary school back then. People have forgotten how much things have moved on. Now, the science was fine, but the French was a great disappointment. I mean, you could say I became a languages person despite my initial experience. Now, what that experience consisted of, my first French teacher didn't like me and I didn't like her. And her basic style was to put individual pupils on the spot in class. Now, you may not believe it now, but I was a very timid child back then. The more the pressure increased, the less I said. And so she used to go on in front of the entire class about Dobson not saying anything. So I thought I must be rubbish at this language business. And then, strangely enough, when we got to the end of the year, I got an unexpected revenge because, as I say, I was convinced I was no good at languages. But the end of the year exam didn't have an oral test. Now, being timid does not stop you manipulating grammar. So we used to have form positions, of course. When the sheet was put on the board at the end of the year, I was top in French out of a group of 30. Because obviously being able to manipulate language is one of the most fundamental things about being a linguist. So I thought, well, I can't be too bad at languages after this. And then moving on from that, on the basis of the 11 plus, they put me in the second stream of 5. And I got promoted to the top stream of 5, which was the only one that did Latin. And there is a myth around that everybody did Latin at grammar schools. They did not. My wife also went to a county grammar school and did Latin, but she was in the top set as well. So it wasn't an opportunity open to everyone. And when people say, for example, I digress, but anyway, when people say, oh, standards in English have dropped off since we stopped doing Latin, well, 80% even of people in grammar schools didn't do Latin. So you can't blame that not being around for any alleged deterioration in English. Anyway, where was I? Yeah. So started doing Latin, and I thought, well, I'm not too bad at languages after all. And the Latin teacher was brilliant. And of course, being a language you've hardly ever spoke, my timidity, now diminishing a bit, didn't come into play. So we soaked up the grammar. And she had a thing about us singing Christmas carols in Latin. So we sang things like Quem Pastoris and Personent Hodie and so on when we'd been doing Latin for 3 months, something like that. So that was an influence. And then the next thing was, because I was now in the top set, the head of department taught French, because of course there was a tendency for heads of department to skim off the
Cream, yes.
the more able classes. Some people found him terrifying, but I didn't, because he was demanding. But I didn't find him intimidating. He'd got high expectations, and if you were interested in the subject, you didn't have a problem with him. He was one of these extroverts, for example, who, it never happened in the class I was in, but had been known to mark somebody's work and then throw the exercise book out of the window. That was quite a considerable sanction, because his teaching room was just down the corridor from the head's room. And people weren't supposed to go on the front lawn where the book had been deposited. Now, apart from these eccentricities, he was a good teacher. I remember when we moved into what was then called the second year, now year 8, people ahead of me said, oh, it's hard, you know, you do a lot of tenses and things. And I thought, oh, French couldn't get much harder, could it? Now, in some ways, you could argue that the hardest tense to learn in French is actually the present. And I mean, that may be debatable, but anyway, I'll float that one. And so I thought, well, what's ahead here? Well, of course, we did all the compound tenses, perfect, pluperfect, future perfect, etc. So we did 6 new tenses in half a term. And I thought this was wonderful, because you could say more interesting things in more challenging ways. So I enjoyed that. And then the big moment came that a year later, we started Spanish. And this was the lifelong love affair. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. But anyway, I think I took to Spanish for 2 reasons initially. One was that the Spanish pronunciation is assisted if you've got open northern vowels like me and not southern diphthongs in English. So there was no danger of anybody where I live saying Pedro or Antonio when they meant to say Pedro and Antonio, for example. So I felt more at home with the pronunciation from the start. Also, generally speaking, you don't have silent consonants in Spanish like French, which I always found off-putting in French. And the other one may seem strange, but it was the character in the textbook who was called Ramon. He was a campesino, a peasant. Now, the context in which this character operated was a million miles move culturally as well as geographically from a Yorkshire coalfield. But he came over to us as a regular sort of guy. The reason that made an impact was that the French textbook featured a French bourgeois family in a townhouse, a tennis court in the back garden, and a maid, Mélanie la Bonne, in the attic. Well, there weren't many homes like that in the Yorkshire coalfield, so we didn't actually empathise with the character either. And then going back to Spain, I went on 2 school trips to Spain, and the warmth of welcome that we got made me love the place right from the start. So I wanted to know more about Spain and Latin America. So at A-level, I did history, which probably was my strongest subject, but that's another story, with Spanish and French. But for me, so I might even have actually gone on to read history, but for me, it had to be Spanish and the opportunity to learn Portuguese as well. So that's where I ended up through secondary education. So after an inauspicious start, things improved considerably. So I think that's more or less the story up to that point. So we've got to university now, haven't we?
Yes. Do you want to talk about university now and tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to keep talking, but I'm conscious it's an interview. So if you feel to want to interrupt and ask questions.
Well, I think what you said already is absolutely fascinating and gives some really interesting insights into how you got to the point where you then applying to university, which is applying to do languages.
So anyway, I went to Manchester to read Spanish with French and Latin, and then I added Portuguese, which gave me the chance to do a final year option on the Brazilian novel, which tied in a bit with my interest in history. But I better not digress on that one now, at least. Manchester was a good choice for me to build my confidence. One of the main factors was that we got to know the lecturers outside classes through regular tertulias. Now, for a non-Hispanist, a tertulia is an informal gathering of friends to discuss politics, art, or whatever, sport. It could be a literary circle in one sense, but we used to meet in a pub about once a fortnight. And it was entirely up to people whether they went or not. But there were always several members of staff turned up, and we turned up. So we got to know them outside the classroom, which when you were being taught, you related to them as people, and they related to you as well. And the second thing was that we sang traditional Spanish songs in a coro. Now, I'm using the Spanish word because coro is an informal group of people who get together to sing. It's not really a choir. And this was run by the lector, who was an exiled Civil War veteran, who was an interesting character in his own right. And so there was that. And then we did we acted Spanish Society. We did plays by Lope de Vega from Spain's Golden Age, and Garcia Lorca, I think everybody's heard of, the 20th century playwright. And, that built confidence. And then my next thing from that was that Manchester degrees back then, and this wasn't necessarily universal 50, 60 years ago, they all included a term abroad, which fortunately was grant aided like the rest of your course. Some of the LEAs didn't like it, but they had no choice. It was actually written into the regulations. So I went on a term abroad, and then I decided that it wasn't enough. So I asked permission to take a year out to go back to Spain for a year. And I spent that in Madrid. And I financed it by working on a tarmac gang in the summer before I went. And that was an education in itself, which we won't go into on this occasion. And then teaching English classes in Spain. Now that year was the most formative year in my life, I think. One of the frustrations I found about university was that going to classes didn't give you time to read. I would have preferred fewer classes and more time to actually read this stuff. Because I was using my own time and enthusiasm, I got a year to read what I wanted. There's an advantage being a student in Spain back then. I mean, there were disadvantages because of the nature of the regime at that time. But for example, as a student, I was able to belong to the Ateneo, which translates as Athenaeum, but it's not like the Athenaeum in London. It was the leading literary club in Madrid, with its own library. But anybody could join if they got 3 people to nominate them. So I paid 40 pesetas a month, equivalent to about 25 pence, I think it was, something like that in modern money. And had the privilege of using this library with its subsidized cafeteria and guest speakers and so on. Not many students get that chance. And because of the strength of the pound against the peseta, I could travel all around Spain. I could go to the theatre almost weekly. On a different dimension, Real Madrid was my home team. If I tell you I support Sheffield United, that's not won anything significant for 99 years. It was a pleasure to have a home team that actually won things regularly. So that was there. My circle actually included trainee flamenco dancers as well as other students. And that's probably an interesting chapter in itself. And the highlight of the year was a recital by Vicente Alessandri, who was a contemporary of Lorca's. A recital of his own poetry years before he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, which I think was in 1974. I might be a year out with that. So there are a lot of experiences there you wouldn't normally get. And the one I missed out on was that I might have been an extra in 55 Days at Peking with Charlton Heston, but which was filmed in Spain, actually, believe it or not. But I left Spain before they actually started filming, so my career in films never took off. So that was the formative influence. So that sort of pointed me towards becoming a language professional.
Right.
Can I interrupt a moment, John?
Yes, of course.
Another well-known Hispanist, or at least well-known to our generation, was Eric Hawkins. And his book on listening to Lorca is an amazing piece of writing. But Eric, I think it was in that book, or maybe on another occasion, I can't remember, said that for him, as a Liverpudlian, language learning, and Spanish in particular, provided an escape from his working class Liverpudlian background. And Alan, you've talked about being brought up in the South Yorkshire coal mining area. Was it the same for you?
Not sure I like I'm not sure I like the word escape. I know what you mean. I suppose it was escape in a way, but the interesting thing, my granddad had never even been to London, and my father never went abroad either. Somehow I had this interest in what lay beyond where we were. And I know there were people at school who almost regarded it as betrayal, even if you got a job in Sheffield, 12 miles away. But I was fortunate because my parents and grandparents thought this was a great thing.
Yeah.
They'd all left school at 14 or before. So, yeah, I mean, I've always, I'm still proud of those Yorkshire roots, and I'm proud of the opportunities that people gave me through it, because there was no lack of aspiration from my granddad and my parents. I mean, that they just accepted that they wanted me to have the best I could, and if that meant that I'd moved out of the area, I mean, I don't think they'd been too happy if I'd gone to live abroad permanently. But yeah, it was. You could call it an escape, I suppose. I prefer to think it as something complementary, that I got my identity from these people I started off with. I mean, I often think, people say on the shoulders of giants. My dad and my granddad, that's what they were.
Yeah. we better move on. Well, because
I'll
we
get
need
too emotional.
to talk about that too, but
What did I do
also,
next?
well, you became a language teacher.
Yeah, again, I became a language professional almost by default. It's a very unusual trajectory, this, isn't it? My graduate aspiration when I went to university was, when I graduated, was to seek a career in business in Latin America, using my Spanish and Portuguese. That was at 18. At 22, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with Spanish. I know people do, a lot of arts graduates do a particular subject to enjoy it, and then they'd ever really touch it after that. I couldn't see the point of having put so much investment into Spanish, which I loved, not to carry on using it significantly in some way. Like a lot of people of my generation, I did a PGCE. There were a lot of us then thought, because you've got a grant for doing it. A lot of my contemporaries said, well, if you can't think what to do a PGCE while you're thinking about it. You might like teaching.
And just to
You've
interrupt,
extended your education and become more mature by a year as well.
and the PGCE is the postgraduate certificate in education, which in your and my time was not obligatory as a qualification for becoming a teacher, at least not in my time. And I guess we're about the same. But it was the qualification after graduation.
Yeah, just to confuse things, at Oxford they called it diploma in education,
Yeah,
which sounds posher, but that's what it was. Even Oxford calls it PGCE now. Now a lot of people who did a PGCE or equivalent to find their feet and wonder what they want to do, a lot of them decided that teaching wasn't for them. And I don't regard that as negative. I think actually if somebody starts a PGC and finds it concludes from that it's not for them, they've done a lot of pupils a great favor by not making a wrong choice. So I think that there is a positive side on that. But anyway, I decided I could enjoy it. And if I could just digress for a moment, because I think this is important, because again, non-linguists who have had an influence on me. When I went to Oxford from Manchester, because I wanted to see what this Oxbridge thing was about, and I must say I enjoyed a tutorial system. My major reservation about a red brick university was there were too many classes and not enough space. But anyway, that's by the way. I was very fortunate that in my personal tutor in Oxford, because he was Bill Taylor, later Sir Bill, who was an 11+ failure, so-called, who ultimately became director of the London Institute of Education, now part of University College, UCL, and principal of Blondin and vice chancellor of Hull, and many other things besides. And alongside my history teacher, he was the most inspirational person I've ever met. When I knew him, he sadly died last year at a ripe old age, but he was an almost unknown 34-year-old who'd just moved from Durham, as it happened, who had this infectious passion for education. I mean, you couldn't help but be fired up by it. And I only met him once later, many years later, when I was an HMI, and he actually remembered me. I think one of the reasons he remembered me was that my father died while I was at Oxford. And Bill Taylor was wonderful. And I think that's why he remembered me. But anyway. But he was a great man. Oh, hit the top, but such a lovely person. And I think, in education, if you meet people like that, you are privileged. So that's how I ended up as a language professional.
And became a secondary school teacher, or what?
Of course, we're moving on to the section. I thought we'd done 2 sections. Yeah, for me, my career, I suppose, is in 3 stages: pre-HMI, HMI, and post-HMI. I started my career as an aspiring Hispanist. The problem you had being a Hispanist then was that it was a minority language in schools. Hispanists could hardly get a full timetable. Anyway, they had to make it up with French or other things. Most Spanish was actually taught from the age of 13 or 14 onwards in upper secondary and then into further education. So to get a full timetable of Spanish, most of my career was actually spent in further and higher education. The interesting thing about that was that if you would, as Hispanist, you didn't inherit people who'd done the language before from other people. So at whatever level I was teaching at, I always taught beginners, whether it was people aiming for A-level, post-A-level, adult education, whatever. And I think that's important because I think particularly if people spend a lot of their time teaching at the top end of secondary or further education or higher education, there is a danger they lose their sensitivity to the needs of beginners. And I've always believed that what learners have in common is anxiety, and that we need to remind ourselves of the needs of beginners. And another thing I believe there is that we should all try a new language occasionally to remind ourselves what it's like. So, for example, I try at various points just to get that initial experience. I've tried Urdu, I've tried Arabic, and I've tried Polish. I've not made great progress in any of those, but the important thing I took out of as a professional was just how terrifying it can be when you're learning a language from scratch. Because I think most people are anxious when they're doing it, even if they don't let on. The thing that came from the Spanish was that we were missionaries. Hispanists had to stick together. We had close contact through the Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese, which was a national association set up because Spanish was neglected. I was national chair for 9 years. I edited its journal, Vida Hispanica, for 9 years. 50 years on, the status of Spanish has been transformed, almost at parity with French. But if you think in the 1970s, for every learner doing Spanish, there were 14 doing French. In fact, I even had colleagues when I joined the Inspectorate who weren't aware we taught Spanish in schools in this country. And the other thing at that phase was networks. Not just in Spanish, but people of our generation will know that before ALL, Association for Language Learning, was created in 1990, there were 6 separate associations for language teachers. So I belonged to 2 others to keep abreast of movements across the field. So there was the Modern Language Association, which catered mainly for teachers of French. And there was the Audiovisual Language Association, AVLA, which did what it said on the tin, but generally promoted the use of technology, such as it was then, across the board. And it was a time of considerable debate between people who favoured audiolingual teaching and audiovisual teaching, and the grammar translation traditionalists were fighting a rearguard action. So there are a lot of ideas and theories and prejudices flying around at that time. Personally, I always took the view that one ought to be eclectic and not worry too much about what the theoretical source was. Try any idea that might work. If it works, use it. And I must say, when I became HMI, that was the one of the main things, that people worked out what worked for them and used it, and that's what made them good.
Let me interrupt you a moment. You just said something about trying out things, and a couple of our previous interviewees, I'm thinking of Lyd King and Terry, talked about how they experimented a lot, and they were, in a sense, permitted to experiment in their early days as teachers. They were talking about being teachers in secondary schools rather than further and higher. But I wondered if there's something you would think about in your, daily teaching experience, which stands out as important for you in the way that they talked about the chance to experiment. And Stephen Fawkes talked about trying things out as well, with no curriculum, as it were, very few materials that he used anyway.
Yeah, you had to make a lot of it from scratch, particularly if you were a Hispanist, because although the Spanish Consejería, the Spanish Embassy in London, is wonderful with what it provides, there was nothing then compared with what the French and Embassy and the Goethe Institute provided for their people. One of the things that took a lot of energy, actually, was because there was so little stuff, that you had to find the authentic text to work with, because there weren't textbooks. So you had to make it up as you go along. What I would pay tribute to was the BBC courses. I mean, I think the most useful textbook I ever had was a thing called Spanish for Beginners, surprise, surprise, which the BBC did in the 60s, which is actually intended for adult education. But I used it with a class of 16-year-old girls. And the beauty about it was it had a simple narrative, and it had simple explanations of grammar, so that you got interest in the language being used, and you got simple explanations as to how it all fitted together. And I always remember with that group, I suppose it was a bit like me with the Ramon, my Spanish peasant, in my textbook, I could relate to. The story included a boy called Pepe and his girlfriend called Dolores. And these girls got hooked on this story. And one day I went along and I thought, but they seem to know what we're now doing. And it turned out they got so carried away with the story that they'd actually read ahead to find out what happened to this couple. And if only I'd realized that earlier, the extra pace we could have injected into it would have been unbelievable. So yeah, I've never been tied to one particular thing. As I say, eclectic is my my mantra, I suppose. If you've got an idea that interests and it works in a particular way. I mean, I can remember, for example, I briefly taught a group of graduates who were doing marketing. And it was an interesting group because half of them were language graduates and the other half were business studies graduates. I had to teach them beginner Spanish in the same class. And there was one guy in particular in the class who was a bit sniffy about other students. So when we did Spanish pronunciation, I used to do it on two levels. I used to say, well, for the benefit of Peter, this sound is a fricative as opposed to an affricate, or it's a plosive. Sorry, it's a plosive rather than a fricative, and things like that. And for the ones who'd never done a language before, I said the sound that you want for a fricative D in Spanish is to go to pronounce a D and let your mouth open slightly as you're saying it. So it's a the rather than a d. Horses for courses, I think. It seemed to work anyway. And then at a different stage, I was in something else. I was teaching Spanish literature for in a WA Workers' Education Association class, Spanish literature through translation. And then you had to think about that. Well, the beauty of poetry is actually hearing it in the original. And then I realized that if you'd actually been through the poetry with them first in translation, so they knew it was about, and you'd flagged some key words, that they were motivated by hearing you read the poetry by García Lorca, whoever it was. Short pieces, but it gave them that flavor of language. So yeah, I say horse for courses. If it works, use it. Most of the time, I think it did. Sometimes it didn't. I did actually have when I briefly taught French in a primary school, I actually had one particularly catastrophic occasion. I don't know if we have time for me to go into that, but I was teaching. We were doing numbers in this primary school, and I foolishly said, because I've always believed in mnemonics, that when you say cans in French, it's like cans in English. No, I shouldn't have done that because French is nasalized and the English isn't. So it was a mistake anyway, but it was a first job sort of thing. So when we started to do the numbers in French, they said, "Oh, well, let's chant it together as a class." And so it went 13, 14, and when we got to 15, 28 children said cans, and the 29th said tins. And I learned several things from that nasalization matters in French, and don't use a mnemonic if you don't have to use one. But it was rather funny because it was an open plan school, and the deputy head was going by at the time, and he almost choked with mirth at this situation. So yeah, I learned to laugh at myself then, which again, I think something Stephen Fawkes said actually when he was being interviewed. If you're prepared to laugh at yourselves, people see you as a human being, whatever age they are. Yeah. So we do learn from our mistakes, I think.
Yeah. So in a sense, now we've been talking, or you've been talking about yourself as a teacher, and maybe in a moment we'll move to your views about language teaching, and that will come, your language teaching in the UK and in England in particular, that will come more from your role as an HMI, as an inspector. So perhaps I'll be handing over to John at that point.
Yeah, I just wonder whether perhaps I ought to. Would it be helpful if I actually said something about the HMI role and my experience of it before I get onto wider things about language teaching?
Let's
that be okay?
Well, I don't want to hog things, so I would like to hand over to John, and then you can start talking about how you became HMI and so on before we move on to other things. Shall we do that?
Yeah, let's get the focus on me out of the way and the wider scene after the break. How would that be?
Yeah, let's do that.
That's fine, yeah. Thanks very much, Alan. Um, as an HMI, you would have a particular view on things. Can you tell us something about how that happened and what that particular experience was like?
Yeah, I was appointed originally as the lead HMI for Spanish, but all inspectors inspected French. The HMI role before Ofsted was a real privilege and an eye-opener. I mean, we learned so much from the teachers and pupils that we observed, and were able to feed that back into the system. It was totally unlike the system we have now. We were also warned about being prescriptive and encouraged to have a dialogue with teachers. And as well as being specialists, we all had a regional role as general inspectors. So you learned things like one-to-one conversations with head teachers, no notes taken, both sides being frank. We learned so much about the context, not just of languages, but of everything else that way. The most effective teachers I found were pragmatic in their approach. I might say they were eclectic as well, but that might be betraying my own prejudice in this. What was humbling was many were unaware of just how good they were. I can recall, for example, an outstanding head of department in a deprived school in the Northwest. And when I was feeding back what made the teaching good in his department, he went very quiet, and I thought, have I said something? What? So I said to him, you look puzzled. What is, tell me what the problem is. And he said, yeah, well, when you talk about the pace and the variety and the rapport with pupils and the authentic materials and all that. I said, yeah. He said, doesn't everybody do that? And this guy was probably, in my head, 30 years on, of the top dozen teachers I've ever seen. He was one of them. And yet he had absolutely no idea just how good he was. He thought he was average, and he was outstanding. And you go across people like that, that's what you learn what it's about as an HMI, or you did back then. And then in contrast with that, you've got other schools where teachers operated in silos in their own classrooms when they could have learned so much from each other. I used to say to them, it could be that the guy who's got the answers to the problem you've raised with me might well be teaching next door. Why don't you talk to each other more often? And then I was promoted to lead HMI for languages, Staff Inspectorate it was called, just before the creation of Ofsted. And we had to train the new Ofsted inspectors. Now, the initial model for Ofsted was totally different from what it is now, because the initial model was based on HMI practice as it had evolved over 150 years. And the focus that we were told we should have would be, look at the pupils first. What do the pupils know? What can they understand? What can they do? Not focus initially on the teacher, just ask that question first. Now, what the teacher's doing, obviously, is the main factor in that, but you're inspecting pupils' work primarily. You're not inspecting teachers as such. And, inspection is an art. It's not an exact science, as some people pretend it might be. Whatever criteria you're using, it's always worth adding two basic questions. You're sitting there at the back, and the two questions are, would I be happy for my child or my grandson to be sitting in this class? And the second one is, would my partner be happy to work in this department? And one of the ways of keeping HMI grounded, of course, is a lot of HMIs are married to teachers. And whatever fancy ideas you might have got, coming home and getting an earful at tea time about what it's like on a bad day does actually keep you very much in touch with reality. The investment back then was in specialist subjects rather than in whole school inspection. When Ofsted came in, that changed. There were a lot of losses. One of them was loss of contact with HMI linguists in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I mean, back then you could pick up the phone and ring a colleague and say, "What's it looking like where you are? What have you got that you think might be of interest to us?" and vice versa. So our specialist role was reduced, but because I was the lead, I still sat on national bodies like the Nuffield Inquiry and the National Languages Strategy Group. And it was handy that pre-Ofsted, that HMI were hybrids, that we were involved in policy matters, advising the Department for Education and Science, as it was then, as well as going into schools. So one day you would be in a school and saying, well, the policy implications of what I've seen on the ground are these. The day after, you might be sitting in a meeting at DFE and you're talking about policy, and you'd be thinking, now, hang on a minute, where I've been recently, there would be a problem with that. And you could actually say to officials, now, hang on, our evidence is whatever, X, Y, or Z. So it was a very creative role, I felt then. And then when I retired from HMI, I became an independent consultant and was invited to do evaluations of publicly funded programs for the department, ironically Ofsted itself, CILT, Centre for Information on Language Teaching, and other bodies. The irony was that what I was asked to do as a consultant was the role that HMI no longer fulfilled, because HMI lost the advisory role to the department. But for as an independent person, consultant, you were actually doing precisely that. And then, of course, there was international work, which increased over the next 10 years, but I suppose we're coming to that. So that's basically the story. I think Ofsted had to be created. We had to have a different system to get better coverage of the system nationally. You'll gather that I've got strong reservations about the way it's evolved, and I'm quite conscious of what I regard as losses of the way it used to operate.
Right.
Can I just also think again about our previous interviewees and the way in which I think all of them, but certainly some of them, saw the period in the 1990s and 2000s as language teaching on the up, on language teaching going upwards and being exciting and so on. And then there seems to be a general feeling among our interviewees that things started going downhill. From your perspective as an HMI, but also, of course, in general, is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, broadly. I was asked that question by in another forum recently, and I actually kept what I said then because I think it probably sums it up. See, what I said then was that since the days of audiolingual and audiovisual, there have been many developments in the subject. There have been various layers. So we've had diversification, we've had differentiation, we've had language awareness, we've had graded objectives, we've had CLIL, we've had community languages and so on. Now, all these different layers have deepened our understanding and broadened the potential repertoire of language teachers. So that was the positive thing that I said, but I also, the way I summed up the other side was, we've also seen 4 decades of gains and losses, innovation and missed opportunities, attributable at least in part to political initiatives or interference depending which word you prefer to use. There's also been a tendency among certain politicians to, notably a particular Minister of State, to imagine that there was an golden age of high standards some 30, 50 years ago, and the way to success is to turn things back. Now, I don't accept that there was a golden age back then, because I was there, and I was an O-level examiner and an A-level examiner, and I haven't forgotten what I saw. So it is a myth that things were so much better in the past. And then, as previous interviews have said, the great progress was made in the 90s, particularly under the national languages strategy. Take-up of languages at Key Stage 4 from the age of 14, that is, peaked at the end of the millennium. But they were then dealt a heavy blow because Labour withdrew the requirement for language to be studied at 14. We had language colleges which achieved a great deal, which were actually invented by Conservatives and developed by Labour. And they raised the profile and status of languages. And then in 2010, the coalition came in, and it got rid of the national strategy and language colleges and all those things that had caused so much progress, not just in take-up, but in quality as well. So yeah, I suppose I am echoing what other colleagues have said. I think perhaps I ought to say something about the national curriculum as well at some point, because other interviewees have expressed a view on that as well. So we can go there next if that's where you
Well, yes, because I don't know, personal perspective on that was I started in teaching. There was no national curriculum, and I lived through the creation of the national curriculum. I moved out of secondary school teaching and into teacher training when the national curriculum was dominant and to some extent changing as each subject area realized that it wasn't the whole curriculum, and you couldn't take all the time of the children, etc., etc. That's just a flippant way of putting it, but yeah, the national curriculum. I mean, after all, we were one of the few countries which had no national curriculum until the 1980s, 70s, 80s.
Well, the only compulsory subject was religious education. I mean, maths and English weren't actually compulsory. I mean, fortunately, everybody managed to do them. Science wasn't necessarily taught that much beyond the first years of secondary for average pupils. It was in the schools that knew what they were doing. The kids got a very good education, very good balanced curriculum. The ones that weren't, it was a hodgepodge of things that, not to take anything away from the way individual subjects were taught in the individual classrooms, but in terms of the overall experience, there wasn't much coherence or balance about it, and that was one of the frustrations. So I think a national curriculum was needed. In languages, I think we had one advantage. It was the last subject to have its program of study. So to some extent, it had learned from the experience of other subjects, and also because at that point language was only in secondary. It was starting from scratch as a national curriculum, which is another thing. One of my regrets is the first version of the national curriculum, which was inspired partly by Council of Europe work, offered a route to effective teaching and learning. And I can remember going to Council of Europe meetings that copies of our national curriculum modern languages papers were actually coveted by European counterparts, particularly from for example, colleagues from the Baltic states who were still trying to, having just emerged from the Soviet Union, were trying to reform their systems. And UK education generally stood high with them. And the language groups I went to, they were always asking me, well, can we have copies of your papers? The initial national curriculum may have been over-ambitious and a little over-detailed, but sadly, successive changes by both Labour and Conservative governments eroded the expectations in the programme of study. The programme of study, I was asked last year about how I'd found good practice over the years in being privileged to observe what people were doing. And I suggested then that there were three elements which were linked to what the national curriculum was trying to do. One was to maximize exposure to the target language. Another was to ensure that learners had the knowledge and the confidence to manipulate structures. And the third one, providing opportunities for them to show initiative and cope by improvising. Now, these features were embedded in the original programme of study. Unfortunately, too many teachers focused on the areas of experience instead, which tended to encourage topic-based teaching and vocabulary learning. One aspiration of the national curriculum, many have not realised this, but I checked this with my predecessor, Christopher Whittick, who was there when who sadly is no longer with us. And he said the first group that devised that thing, the aim was to actually pitch expectations in modern languages above GCSE, to be more demanding and more interesting and so on. Unfortunately, when they started revising it, with pressure from politicians, textbook publishers, and some examiners, the norm was pushed back towards GCSE rather than building on GCSE and going beyond that. So that was one thing. The second thing around that time was, which I've already referred to, the investment in professional development over a decade achieved a lot. Probably the best inset program I've ever seen was Links into Languages, which provided professional development of high quality and highly valued by teachers who joined in it. It was a national program. That disappeared in 2010 as well, with all the other things. We also lost LEA support. Most LEAs had advisors, some of whom were outstanding at that time. We lost CILT, Centre for Information on Language Teaching. As one teacher said to me, we've lost the glue in the system. We still had EU programs to provide networking, and then Brexit happened. So one could go on, but there have been a lot of mistakes made by policymakers, I think, both political and professional. Things like wanting everything today, trying to push policy ahead of the evidence, seeking panaceas. I don't think there are panaceas in education. I think there are you try to find best fit solutions for whatever challenge that you're facing, and if that's the best you can do for the pupils, then that's what you're there for. Context, people don't really take into account. It's totally different trying to teach languages in an Anglophone country than in countries which are not English speaking. So I'm starting to ramble a bit, John. Perhaps I better.
Well, yeah, could I kind of come in with one point? I think really interesting on the national curriculum, as deputy head and then head teacher, I was in the management side of things and trying to deliver, which wasn't always straightforward. And you had the business of Ofsted ringing you up saying they're coming in later that week, the next day or whatever, a sort of threatening kind of thing, like a cloud over things. But what I wanted to ask you was, you've got these attainment levels, which are pretty natural ones, speaking, reading, writing, or whatever. But do you think that the speaking side of things was tended to be devalued, and teachers were having trouble actually effectively dealing with the spoken side of language?
I think there may be a bit of hindsight in this, but I did express reservations at the time. Obviously, exposure to target language is a fundamental part of the experience that learners have. I don't think most teachers were ready for the idea that you should be teaching through the target language all the time. There were some schools that had already done it and they were comfortable with it, but there are others that weren't. And I think that caused quite a bit of loss of confidence. The other thing is I do actually have personal reservations about situations in which you can use the target language, in that sometimes, particularly if you're explaining a grammar point, the language you need to use to explain it is more difficult than the point you're trying to explain. I found this when I did the Open University German course on the basis of a sort of self-taught level of around GCSE. It was a brilliant course, but what I found was in the second year, when we were probably at around A level, something like that, they suddenly switched and put all the instructions in the book in German, whereas in the previous one, although we heard and read a lot of German, if you wanted to look up a grammar point or something, or find out what the instruction was that you were supposed to do, you could actually look at it in English and knew what you were supposed to be doing. When in the second year we got all the instructions in German, I spent as much time trying to understand the explanation than I did trying to understand the original point. So I've always had this idea myself that there must be you put whatever percentage on it you like, but there has to be an opportunity at some point where you have to use English and use it constructively. I think we've got more pragmatic about that since then. I must say, when you saw language teaching in full cry in a department that really knew what it was doing using the target language, the experience was beautiful. I mean, I can't describe it any other way. When it really clicked, it was beautiful. But people tended to imagine that everybody could operate like that and do it overnight. And it didn't mean that they weren't good teachers. It's a bit like, for example, there are many top-class players in the Premier Division in football, but there are world-class players who stand out among those.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same in any profession. There are teachers with the X factor. You can, up to a point, you can explain what makes them good about the technique, but there is that X factor there. I don't know if it's instinct, born teachers, whatever. It somehow comes together for them spontaneously. And it's wonderful when you see it. But you have to say to their colleagues, there is an X factor there in your colleague. It doesn't mean to say that you're failing if you can't operate like that, because very few of us can. But learning technique is transferable, and learning ideas are transferable. Yeah.
I wonder if we should move on, because time is also moving on because you mentioned earlier the EU and Brexit and so on, and the politics of all of this. And I know, Alan, that I think we met probably in Strasbourg rather than somewhere in England at the Council of Europe. And you mentioned a moment ago how the Baltic countries in the 90s saw Britain, perhaps England in particular, the national curriculum as something to find inspiration in. But what about the other way around? Can you tell us about your work at the EU and the Council of Europe and what that tells you and therefore us about language teaching in Britain then and indeed now?
Yeah. I think the way into that is a point I was alluding to a few minutes ago. The situation our teachers are in is different from non-Anglophone countries. If you're in a country which is not English speaking, the extrinsic motivation provided by English as a world language is a driver on its own. Even to the point, I mean, I've been in Spain and Latin America, where when parents are looking for extra coaching for their children, they prioritize coaching for English as a foreign language over their national coaching in their national language and maths. That's the premium that's on it. If you've got extrinsic motivation like that, it's a massive advantage, particularly if you're hearing English all the time and you've got more curricular time for it. I mean, two perspectives from colleagues from abroad. A senior colleague from Spain who had a number of years working in schools in the UK looked at the situation of English teachers and the uphill struggle they've got. And she summed it up in Spanish. She said, "Son héroes." They're heroes.
Heroes.
And then a group of Dutch inspectors came and visited mainstream comprehensives. And I met them at the end of the thing. And you could more or less summarize what they said. They said something like, "Your teachers are better than ours, but your students perform worse." And what they put it down to, they say, well, 80% of the English our students have doesn't come from school. That they get it through films, TV in English. English is everywhere. It's just there. If you've got to develop intrinsic motivation, and on less time, it's an uphill struggle. What was interesting was going around Europe was that I had a double perspective, because some of the time I attended official meetings as a civil servant on policy matters. And then other times that I went, it was to seminars or workshops as an invited expert in a particular capacity. So, for example, when we were developing the European language portfolio, I was involved in that. I was on the first feasibility study, not because I was an English HMI, but because they thought I got something to contribute. One of the things I think has greatly benefited language teaching in Europe was the Common European Framework of Reference. I mean, this was a major achievement, which is now the framework's achieved worldwide currency. I mean, it took, as Mike knows, it took 10 years from proposal to publication. And the Council of Europe, I think, deserves a great deal of credit for it, because although the European Union, which is a totally different organization, as many people forget, although they adopted it, I don't think they could have created it, because the Council of Europe operates on, it's not tied down to short-term targets. It can develop things over time, and it can work by consensus. And it was such an achievement that we ended up with the framework. And one of the godfathers of it, of course, was John Trim, former director of CILT, former director of linguistics at Cambridge, and many other things beside. And I can remember the debate in there, that 40 members of states, and there was one debate where half the people said, well, we don't need this. And the other half of us said, we do need it, but we don't know how we're going to do it. And the 10 years down the line of discussion with colleagues, we actually agreed on a framework. And that was without a vote in the plenary. 47 member states got to the point where they could actually say, we'll adopt this initiative. And they, you know, I go to Chile, and colleagues have been to Japan and other places far flung outside Europe. The Common European Framework is what they work with. The only disappointment there is that most teachers and teacher educators think only in terms of the attainment scales in the Common European Framework. Now, as I understand it from conversations with John Trim way back, the scales were actually the afterthought, that the framework was a framework for thinking about teachers, about teaching, sorry. And it had this wonderful phrasing in it. I can't remember precisely how it went, but something like teachers may wish to consider the following. And it gave a set of options that you could use. That I've often thought, if departments could sit down, for example, looking the other day, it had a thing on how you handle with errors and mistakes in a classroom. And the framework, it doesn't tell you what you should do, but it sets out the possibilities and makes a distinction between errors and mistakes and things like that. And then the parallel development with the framework was the European language portfolio, which we probably don't have time to talk about now, which never really caught on but might have. But then again, it was very similar to records of achievement, which we had in the UK back then. And in fact, the reason I was invited to be on the feasibility group for it was that people said, well, they've got records of achievement in the UK. That's a similar development. You know, what can we learn from that? And then the other European thing was the European Centre for Modern Languages in Graz, which is a wonderful centre and which still exists. But unfortunately, the UK withdrew from it. And one of the saddest days of my career was when the UK said it was leaving in 2011, and I was chair of the board at the time. And I had to announce from the chair that my country was leaving the ECML, which was a very painful experience. Now, fortunately, my colleagues didn't hold it against me personally. And perhaps I should say the ECML generously, although we're not a member state, most stuff on its website is open. It's free. You can use it. Now, okay, most of it's aimed at people who are teaching English abroad. Yeah, there is that. It's not quite us. But if you look at the stuff and think, well, it's different, but how might we learn from it? It's there. It's a resource. It's free. And we're not even paying for it as you taxpayers. So you gather I'm enthusiastic about that. And
do you think? Can I just?
Yeah.
Can you put your finger on a precise influence from the Council of Europe work in general, all the things you mentioned and others in England or the UK? We haven't, for example, at least to my knowledge, and I'm out of it now, but used the levels, the infamous A to A1 to C2 levels, in the way that some other countries really do use them in a very practical way. That's just an example.
I think what happened there was that it came out just after we'd set the levels for the national curriculum, because it came out in 2000 or 2001, I think, the framework. well, the national curriculum had already on its third revision by then. What did have mileage was you remember that there was the languages ladder run by Cambridge, which used the not it wasn't an exact alignment, but a pretty close alignment to common European framework levels. One of the things that happened, of course, in 2010, 2011, was that the language ladder got removed, and that was sad in many ways, because I think it was at that point it was operating in 26 languages. So it gave an assessment framework for community languages and so on, which wasn't, generally speaking, available otherwise. And also it gave some prestige or recognition to language achievement other than as measured by GCSE or A level, that there are worthwhile things you can do in language that don't lead to an exam like that. And then that was swept away as well. And I think in that sense, in terms of social mobility, let's face it, modern languages is probably the most middle-class subject at university after medicine and law. It was in 1972 at a conference paper I was looking at the other day, and I think it still is. There are many reasons why working class kids don't go on with languages. I mean, our generation, things like going abroad costs money, for example. The image of elitism about languages can put people off as well. In our day, some of us beat the odds because we got local authority maintenance grants for our education, and dare I say, we had decent social housing. I mean, I wasn't doing my homework in one of the terrace houses at the bottom of the hill, with damp growing up the wall. It was pretty basic, but the roof didn't leak, and we had a fire. It still meant you basically did your homework in the same room as your parents. You didn't have a space to yourself, but we did have those things. I think you've got to be able to offset some of these things. I know.
Yeah. So I mean, we don't want to finish on a sad note, as it were, but so offsetting might be a key word here then that you've just used. Are you optimistic that, of course, politics is part of the issue now? We've got a new government, etc. But are you optimistic or pessimistic looking to the next decade, say?
Let's say I'm less pessimistic rather than more optimistic. I mean, I think, trying to avoid politics insofar as one can, but I think governments of different shades, and when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean on the party, because one of the things you learn as a civil servant is that when ministers change, although they're from the same governing party, the spectrum of views that they actually have varies considerably. And some politicians have a lot of time for experts. They'll still ask you critical questions, which is their job, about what they do. They do not start from the basis that if you're if you're an expert in education, you're unsound in somewhere or ivory tower. Even if in English British educational research stands high in the world, as Mike particularly will know. So it depends what mix of people you get. If there was money around, I know what we'd do. personally, I think somebody's got to grasp the nettle and try and try and get us back into some kind of Erasmus arrangement with our European. I suppose they are partners, even though we're not members of the same organization. I think there are things there that one could do.
So what if there were money, you say, and Erasmus is one thing, although I don't think it costs that much money, as it were, it's more a political decision. But if there were money, just to kind of finish off, what 2 or 3 things would you say we should do? Put you on the spot a little bit.
I think you need some kind of CILT. Not necessarily the way it used to operate, but I think given that the position of languages in this country and the uphill struggle that teachers have is such, I think you do actually need a national focus like that brings people together, particularly since so many other networks have been shattered. I think you need more scope need to restore some of the things that were possible when we had Erasmus and aren't possible under the new Turing program, for example. Building on local networks. LEAs had their faults, some worked better than others. But when it worked well, teachers knew where to go, that they had a place to come together and so on and share ideas. Because they, a teacher's best asset is his or her colleagues. And it's partly a question of individual attitude, of being prepared to work with colleagues and be frank with them and not freak out if they're in your classroom and things like that. But it's also creating the conditions in which they can come together in an appropriate way. So yeah, I think there are ways ahead. I mean, I wrote a piece for the ALL, Association for Language Learning, last year. And the view I took there was that language teachers have been through a lot, but whatever they've been through, and particularly thinking of ALL, and of course there's also NALA, National Association of Language Advisors, to which I belong. They've always found ways of keeping the flame alight against the odds. And, our generation, we once had the youthful energy to take on a lot of these things. I see no reason why we should assume that the current generation don't have the similar energy and commitment that we had in our 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever. They must do. And when you retire, you don't meet as many, but I know they do. Mm. So I think the thing is to do everything you can to keep their morale up, and point out, don't be so necessarily so self-effacing. When I used to nominate teachers to go to Council of Europe workshops, you get some outstanding teacher or teacher educator, and they say, why me? And I said, well, you can do it. And they were very nervous about going. UK teachers in going to these workshops, they quite often ended up running the show. They were in demand for chairing groups. They were in demand for doing presentations. They were in demand for being rapporteurs. I remember one going along. She was worn out by the end of the week because she was the Brit was the only person that had 3 languages to the same level. So when they were working in English and French and they were creating new material, she was having to operate as a translator half the time, and nobody could hack German except her. And the only complaint I ever had from anybody that we sent on that was that she'd enjoyed the experience, but she was worn out because she was the most multilingual person present. Because again, people forget, and there's some excellent language teachers in Europe, but a lot of them have got English only. And if you go on to second foreign language, you talk to Sweden, for example, outstanding at producing speakers of English. They've said to me, we're worried about our second foreign language. You know, it's a different world. Yeah. So one could go on, and I suppose I have somewhat, but that's possibly one of my failings, among others.
No, but it's been a fascinating conversation. I think
Yes,
maybe,
completely.
I don't know, John would like to round off for us.
No, well, I think very impressive. And you come from such an experience, HMI and all the things before, which really give it a broad understanding. I mean, you're in a position to talk about such a number of things that other people haven't directly covered, and that's made this a really valuable interview. So I think it's going to be a real value to researchers and teachers.
Could I crave your indulgence for a moment? Because I think you've asked other people, is there anything we would have talked about if we'd had time?
Yes, that was the final statement.
Just briefly, some of the others have mentioned the case for languages, you know, the instrumental case as opposed to the cultural case, although they both go together as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think the instrumental case has been overstated, but it's also been understated. You know, people say, well, the only jobs apart from teaching are interpreting and translating in languages. So what's the point? Do they ever ask when someone's reading English or history, what's the point? I mean, if the people we turn out who aren't teachers don't become translators or interpreters, is that somehow a failure? I mean, if somebody reads history and they don't become an archivist, is that failure? If somebody's read English literature and doesn't become a literary critic, is that failure? You know, we ought to make more of this. And so the cultural case is no less strong for us than it is for any other humanities subject. In fact, you could argue it's stronger because, okay, I love history, I love literature, but we do it in more than one language. And we live within the experience of the language, whether we're there or reading or talking to people, whatever. As a cultural input, you know, our subject has a lot to offer. And also, you may not be using the language all the time, but psychologically, it matters. When I was doing bilingual education, evaluating my bilingual education in Latin America, that's bilingual in the sense of Spanish speakers doing English. Yeah, obviously, I was working with English departments, and the quality of English of many of the teachers was outstanding, including one who'd never left Chile in her life, incidentally. That's another story. But head teachers and governors didn't necessarily have English. And so being able to sit down with them in Spanish, in Portuguese, and talk about what it was all about, or teachers in schools that felt threatened by colleagues on the bilingual program as taking something away from them, to actually be able to sit down and talk to them. You know, that's not to be discounted. And finally, I mean, literally finally, the Council of Europe notion of a repertoire of languages where you may have several languages at different levels, and some it might be a very minimalist level. But the minimalist level counts, I think, as an indicator of goodwill. I was on a Council of Europe language policy team in Slovakia some years ago, and the working language of the group was actually French, which is an interesting challenge for a Hispanist, because sometimes I slip in words that I think are French and are actually modification of Spanish, but that's another story. But one of the things that really won them over was that some members of the team had actually learned a few greetings in their language, or had learned to thank somebody in their language, or even in the odd case with painstaking use of a dictionary, had actually managed to put together a one-line email in Slovak. And it made such a world of difference, even though relationships were very, 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 very positive. And I know that when I've been in groups with German speakers, because my German is pretty basic, and on particularly one occasion, somebody said, "Oh, a typical Brit, doesn't know much language," and one of the Austrian colleagues said, "Ah, but you haven't heard him speak Spanish." And immediately it changed, because the currency was that it didn't matter if you hadn't learned their language, but the fact that a Brit was prepared to learn somebody else's language properly, that mattered. You suddenly become one of them, which you wouldn't be otherwise. So that is my final digression, I think. But thanks for the invitation to contribute to this. And if I'd not been quite as focused as I might have been, I apologize for that.
Well, there's no need for apology. As John has already said, there's a lot, and there could be a lot more, which we have great value to teachers, but also to researchers and so on, because you've got that inside view over many years. Well, so thank you very much then,
Yes,
Alan.
thank you.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation.